In the era of racial justice movements, when the comparative humanities has been called to examine how whiteness is cumulatively embedded in the practice of what John Guillory has recently called professing criticism, the term appropriationism, as distinct from appropriation art, which generally refers to conceptualist art practices in the 70s and 80s, appropriationism has gained renewed traction as a political concept, charged with fraught experiences of boundary violation under conditions of linguistic, territorial, cultural, and subjective destitution, and increasingly a catalyst for debates around personal and collective cultural property rights, authorship and ownership, theft, and racial dispossession. These debates are especially relevant to legal disputes involving copyright infringement and the poaching of creative property and heritage culture, as well as to what I sometimes think of as syllabus politics concerning appropriationism in the teaching of artists and thinkers of color. At worst, appropriationism is synonymous with cultural vampirism and racial extractivism. At best, it is a strike against capitalist ownership models of creative property. Either way, appropriationism, I think, has become a watchword in the parlance of contemporary social justice. So, appropriationism is, of course, an ism and is based off the term appropriation, derived etymologically from Greek oikos, meaning home, hearth, household, domestic economy, family, and that which is familiar. In Stoic ethics, oikeiosis is variously rendered in English as appropriation, orientation, familiarization, affinity, affiliation, endearment, and the perception of something as one's own. So if we follow this logic of home associated with the term, we tap into attendant psychic anxieties associated with domestic incursion, the violation of mental habitus, and the fear of eviction. Appropriation delimits spatial and psychic zones of having and owning, while also conjuring actions of seizing and grabbing. The latter taps into the violence of the concept as such, with the root sept denoting to grasp, to seize, to take hold of. Benveniste reminds us that taking is foundational to transcultural social structures of kinship and governance. In the Dictionary of Indo-European Concepts and Society, he maintains that the etymological vagaries of the Hittite root do, to take, reveal that, quote, semantic shifts comparable to that undergone by the English word take in the expression to take to occurred within the ancient languages, but in different directions. While Hittite da restricted the sense to take, the other languages, he says, constructed do with the idea of destination, which results in the sense to give, end of quote. I would say that the slippage or the slippages between give and taking to, like the slippage among homeness, ownness, and mineness, forge bridges between oikos and proprios, the Latin word for property, yielding French notions of amour propre and bien propre. And from there, you could say the whole proto-capitalist reward system of the ego, with its penchant for accumulation, flows. Lockean's, as well as Lockean constructs of property in the person, and C.B. Macpherson's model of possessive individualism. Derrida's deconstruction of le propre becomes also relevant here, particularly his readings of Levinasian alterity as the domain of the non-proper, and his dilations on the depropriative effects of signature and proper name, whereby iterative inscription is divested of self-ownership and the singularity of enunciation is deferred and disseminated. And on this point, we can recall Derrida's play on Searle and the statement in Limited Ink, quote, evidently John R. Searle and myself do not sign here or speak for ourselves, we are nothing more than the prête-noms, borrowed names, straw men, end of quote. So the deconstruction of le propre derails the bounded liberal subject and its acquisitorial empire. It gestures towards an alternative space of political subjectivity as collective commons or set of properties in common, a distributive model of community stripped of single author claims and the ability to commit extractive appropriationism on others. And it countermands the jouissance in the French legal phrase for property ownership, la jouissance des biens, foundational to concepts of self-ownership and auto-satisfaction, with a jouissance synonymous, as Jean-Luc Nancy has argued, with the subject's dissolution and impossible appropriation. So these anchoring points in philology and theory complement appropriationism's complex aesthetic genealogy, which spans classical mimesis, the anxiety of influence, postmodern intertextuality, the cannibalization of styles in popular culture, pastiche, sampling, and signifying. In the 70s and 80s, the expression appropriation art took off in reference to the use of pre-existing objects with little or no transformation. Duchamp's ready-mades, Warhol's Campbell's soup cans, Jeff Koons's hyperrealist Michael Jackson sculpture, Barbara Kruger's I Copy, Therefore I Am, Richard Prince's serial reproduction of Marlboro Man advertisements. Oh, whoops, that's out of order. Let's see, there's Prince. Cindy Sherman's untitled film stills, Sylvia Kalbowski's Parfum Paloma Picasso, rebranded as Parfum Niki de Saint-Phal, and Sherry Levine's rephotography of Walker Evans's famous Farm Security Administration photographs. What was common to works like these was their desire to stretch the frame of almost same and to topple the sacred pillars of originality, authorship, and authentication. Artists associated with the pictures generation, a group often exhibited together between 1974 and 84, including Richard Prince, David Sally, Barbara Kruger, Cindy Sherman, Louise Lawler, and Levine, subscribed to the notion that a picture is a palimpsest of representations, often found or appropriated, rarely original or unique. We are not in search of sources or origins, Douglas Crimp would famously proclaim, but of structures of signification. Underneath each picture, there is always another picture, end of quote. The critique of the picture went along with the critique of art's commodification as a value form. Writing about Sherry Levine, Craig Owens contended that, quote, in representing these canonical images of the rural poor, the expropriated, Levine was calling attention to the original act of appropriation, whereby Evans first took these photographs, as if to illustrate Walter Benjamin's observation in The Author as Producer on the economic function of photography. Photography, this is still Owens, has succeeded in making even abject poverty by recording it in a fashionably perfected manner into an object of enjoyment, i.e. a commodity. So appropriation art exposed the fetish aspect of both art and commodity, mixed up together in the mill of commercial simulacra and abyssal reality effects. In an 1986 show at the New Museum titled Damaged Goods, artist-curator Judith Barry wrote about rupturing the white box of the museum by combining display techniques from retail, theater, and natural history museums. The German capitalist realists, Gerhard Richter and Sigmar Polke, worked off found photographs, with Richter producing a blurry, painted rendition of a famous photo of Ulrike Meinhof, dead in Stammheim prison in 1977, and Polke confecting collages like supermarkets that showcase superheroes shopping at a grocery store. Within the 70s and 80s conceptualist landscape, the picture artists and the capitalist realists appear as precursors of decelerationism insofar as they put an inflated economy of images in their sightlines. Drawing on techniques of copying, repetition, citation, simulation, and plagiarism, they exposed ways in which art and capitalism feed off each other as profit-extracting engines of commercial image reproduction. And there's an interesting feminist critique of masquerade in play as well, urging the cultural takeover of feminine makeover, with the gamut of poses, cosmetic surfaces, and the performance of pleasure for the benefit of propping up masculinity. While the appropriation artists were targeting patriarchal authorship and capitalist expropriation, another critique of appropriationism boiled up, this time from the reception of the Primitivism show curated at the Museum of Modern Art in 1984 by William Rubin and Kirk Barnadoe. To many critics, the show epitomized blinkered Eurocentric curation. Its exhibition premise, the European abstractionists were influenced by African, Oceanic, and Aboriginal art, put the history of epistemicidal violence and colonial plunder on display. Euro artists were caught in the act of rifling through a global catalog of native artifacts with little or no regard for their context, tradition, and sacred use. At the time, it certainly succeeded in exposing the appropriationist underbelly of rubrics like affinity or influence, henceforth tainted as euphemisms for cultural theft. Now, this is really a journey in memory lane here. On the issue of influence, let's also recall that throughout the heyday of postmodernism, Harold Bloom's agonistic anxiety of influence paradigm was regnant in literary studies and the analysis of transgenerational interrelation, supplanting Walter Jackson Bates' more conventional notion of the burden of the past. So if you remember, his book, Anxiety of Influence, appeared in '73. It didn't actually employ the term appropriationism, which I think actually, on second thought, never really entered literary criticism very much. It really was more of an art critical term. So you don't find an entry for it, say, in the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, or in the Critical Terms for Literary Study, the Lentrichia and McLaughlin volume of 1990. Instead, in that last one, you find an entry on influence, which is devoted almost entirely to Bloom, and summarized as the poet's reaction, formation against, and misprision of the precursor text through the trope of irony. In a restituting moment, wrote Bloom, the writer proceeds to recover the transcendental implications of the earlier text's vision that were thwarted by its elided negation, its lack of irony, its inauthentic idealization, so that this vision now becomes a part of his work. And of course, what you get here is a murderous theory of influence, right? The strong poet basically has to blow up or blot out the precursor. So concurrent with this Oedipal high drama theory of influence was the much drier semiotic post-structuralist theory of intertextuality, where Bloom retained focus on individual authors and the temporal frames of literary history. Intertextual critics like, remember them, Michael Rifater, Jonathan Culler, Gérard Genette, concentrated on phrases and textual citations independent of biographical authors, situating them in the eternal present of the text as read, which is to say, actualized in real time by reader reception. Rifater specified that intertextuality was not just a newfangled name for influence or imitation, nor something to be used as a basis of comparison to point out the author's originality, but rather a mimetic predication of literariness on everyday language. And of course, his famous examples were literature au deuxième degré, littérature au deuxième degré, second degree or second-hand literature, highlighting pastiche, cut and paste, quotation, parody, caricature and imitation, all of which assumed a kind of non-propriability. Every piece of text was essentially citational in and of itself. Thus, all voicings and literary modes of vocative address, including prosopopeia, were available for appropriation and subject to a kind of wink-wink of invisible quote marks. Intertextuality, marked as a condition of the propriable or propriability, became a fundament of postmodern literature, conducive to historical eclecticism, remixing, ventriloquizing, sampling, translating, and upcycling. It was left to critics like Friedrich Jameson to worry about the dehistoricizing impact of such jumbled stylistic devices. Jameson diagnosed them as substitutes of history. And actually, in an interview with Anders Stephenson that took place in '86, he credited E.L. Doctorow with using these devices critically to restore a sense of history in his novel Ragtime. And I don't think I have time to go through that, so I'll just jump over, but we can come back. So, postmodern appropriationism finds a very different foothold in 1989 with the publication of Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s watershed study, The Signifying Monkey, A Theory of African American Literary Criticism. I asked Michael last night at dinner, do you remember The Signifying Monkey? And he said, nobody reads that anymore. Though Gates didn't refer to appropriationism per se, his archaeology of Black vernacular modes of signifying amounted to a theory of it as an empowered form of Black troping, harking back to the Yoruba trickster figure Isu Ella Gabara, and to patterns of Black double voicing in post-slavery cultures. Signifying emerges as a mechanism of survival in a world of racist oppression and as a hold-all for creative practices encompassing Black-on-Black ventriloquism, the dozens, toast, rap, hip-hop, and all manner of vernacular art involving what Gates calls teasing, cajoling, and renaming people. Signifying, as he defined it, was political. It functioned as, quote, redress for an imbalance of power to clear a space rhetorically to achieve occupancy in a desired space, end of quote. With regard to its uses in postmodern Black culture, as in Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo or Toni Morrison's jazz, signifying, aligned with restitution and recovery, think of, he says, the Buta Fita, the art nappers conjured by Ishmael Reed, who, quote, were looting the museums, shipping the plunder back to where it came from. It also designated the rewriting of textual tradition for what Gates called a new African American literary history. So white appropriationism of Black vernacular discourse within Euro-American modernism was the subject of Michael North's 1994 book, The Dialect of Modernism, Race, Language, and 20th Century Literature. And of course, he wasn't the first to do this, and many others have followed, but I just mention him because I remember it as a kind of watershed. North demonstrated that in canonical works by authors like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, William Carlos Williams, and Cummings, there was little to show, quote, that the white emulation of African American language and culture had advanced beyond the stage of exaggerating a few verbal cliches. This explained, he says, why writers like Claude McKay, Jean Toomer, and Zora Neale Hurston felt it necessary to struggle as diligently against the standards of the avant-garde as against the standards of its opponents. And I'm about to conclude, get close to the conclusion. So, the critique of white appropriationism is, of course, hardly new. We have only to think of the charges leveled against Elvis, and also in literature, you know, famous examples like Faulkner's appropriation of the Chickasaw word for river, Yaknabatafa, or you know, more recently a poem by Natalie Diaz, Manhattan is a Lenape word. I mean, there's a a long history and groundswell around these critiques of white appropriationism. And I think they've gathered steam in the 2000s. White Gen Z slang and modes of speaking have been accused of ripping off African American vernacular English. The term blackfishing was coined to refer to white celebrities and influencers who cosplayed Black women on social media. The initial choice of a white translator to translate Amanda Gorman's poem, The Hill We Climb, which was delivered at Biden's inauguration, into German, provoked a backlash, prompting the Dutch translator to relinquish the commission. In 2017, Minha Tifam would add the term racial plagiarism to the lexicon, zeroing in on, quote, capitalist processes of value extraction in which racialized groups' resources of knowledge, labor, and cultural heritage are exploited for the benefit of dominant groups and in ways that maintain dominant socioeconomic relationships, end of quote. Fashion designer Marc Jacobs' decision to send out white models in dreadlocks is one of her central examples. The media silences on the hairstyle's history and its deference to Jacobs, with some of Jacobs' defenders questioning the Black origins of dreadlocks, are seen as indicative of how racial harming is diffused within exclusionary media coverage. Racial plagiarism, writes Pham, is, quote, never just about being inspired by, but rather improving on an unrefined, unsophisticated racialized form, quote unquote, reinforcing a system of value in which the originating culture continues to be seen as unrefined. So that's her point. So I don't have time to delve further into literary examples of appropriationism. I'm sure in the discussion all of you have some that we can consider, but I will summarize by way of conclusion that in making a case for appropriation as an aesthetic concept raised up to the level of a political concept, I found it productive to go back to literary postmodernism, appropriation art, and theories of influence and intertextuality, not only because they identified specific techniques of takeover that help us understand the critique of white appropriationism today, but also because they often ignored appropriationism's racial politics entirely. Whether it was the violent extractivism inhering in white appropriationism or the survival through double voicing found in signifying in African American postmodernism, the ambivalent racial politics of appropriationism, especially in literary studies, was not routinely addressed. Today, in addition to addressing these racial politics, I think we confront the unfinished business of what an anti-appropriationist pedagogy might be. One that avoids the concept of cancellation, a total piège in my view, and utterly co-opted by the alt-right, and looks instead to the heuristics of abolitionism, depropriation, and de-accessioning, mapping piratical profiteering in the culture industry, and taking on the truly difficult task of what Ariella Azoulay has called unlearning imperialism. Thank you.